I've heard it too many times, mostly from those soft-eyed poets who've never set paw on sun-baked stone. That cats were worshipped in ancient Egypt, adored, revered, painted gold, and carried on silk. That we were sacred, divine, blessed with 9 lives and bowls always full. They forget that for every cat draped in jasmine and sleeping on a priestess's lap, there were 20 like me, dusty, limping, half melted into shadow. You wouldn't survive as a cat in ancient Egypt, not because the world was cruel, though it often was, but because you'd expect the world to love you for existing. That's not how things worked. There was no temple for me, no name etched in limestone, no gentle palm to rub behind the ear. Just stone, heat, and the endless hiss of sand against skin. I once lived in a city whose name I never learned, where the wind came from the desert and brought stories that no one listened to. I made my home between the legs of broken statues and the corners of kitchens, where fish guts dried faster than you could blink. That smell still clings to my memory. Sweet rot, like old prayers left too long in the sun. At night, the city turned red with quiet. Oil lamps blinked like tired eyes, and I'd watch the priests argue over stars while their sandals squashed beetles into philosophy. I once slept inside a broken amphora for 3 days because I didn't want to hear the sound of another death chant. The priest's cat, a velvet-coated monstrosity named Neferu, told me I lacked the spine to be sacred. I told him I lacked the fleas. In truth, I just didn't like being touched. Not by gods, not by humans, not by those children who always tried to dress me in linen like some miniature pharaoh with whiskers. Once, they tied a tiny scarab around my neck with papyrus string. It jingled every time I moved, so I stopped moving for 3 hours and pretended to be dead. They cried, then ran off to bother the ibis. You might think we had the freedom of the rooftops, the coolness of shrines, the dignity of being more myth than mammal. But I spent most of my time dodging sandals and stolen kicks. One old woman fed me bread soaked in goat's milk and called it a sacred offering. It was mostly just soggy. Once, during a sandstorm, I climbed into the sleeve of a sleeping guard's robe and stayed there until morning. He never knew. Or maybe he did, and was just too tired to care. I liked him. He never tried to rename me. That's the thing. Everyone always tried to name us, as if putting a word on something meant it belonged to them. I went by 20 names in 1 week, and none of them stuck. I preferred the silence. It tasted more like myself. I remember the temples smelled of copper and incense and feet. And the meat, when it was fresh, still twitched from memory. People forget that food moves even after it dies. It's one of those lessons you learn when you're low to the ground. One night, a woman wept into a bowl of lentils and dropped a piece of fig. I stole it and sat with her in silence, chewing slowly. She said I was the only one who stayed. I didn't tell her I just liked figs. Sometimes kindness happens by accident. You wouldn't survive as a cat in ancient Egypt. Not if you expected comfort, or consistency, or even a name that lasted more than a season. But if you could live on smells, on shadows, on the warmth of a wall at noon, and the memory of a fig, you might just learn what it means to exist without needing to be adored. I wasn't a sacred cat. I was just a cat. And that sometimes was enough. I woke up with a pebble in my ear and the taste of yesterday's dust still glued to my tongue. The sun had not yet reached its full cruelty, but the sky was already the color of disappointment. Pale, endless, slightly cracked at the corners like an old clay bowl that someone refuses to throw away. I stretched, slowly, like a question no one wanted to answer, and felt 3 new bites along my back, courtesy of the courtyard fleas, who believed in democracy and took turns. Someone had spilled lentil water near the broken step I slept under, and now the air smelled like warm bitterness and moldy kindness. I sat up and blinked at the world, not because I was surprised it still existed, but because it looked slightly more crooked than usual. The pigeons above me were already arguing theology, flapping like scrolls with opinions. One of them dropped something that hit the edge of my tail. I didn't look. Dignity, after all, is about choosing your battles. A woman across the street was beating dough with the same intensity priests beat their chests during eclipse rituals. Her child sang a song about fish that made less and less sense with every verse. I liked that child. He once offered me half a date, then forgot, and stepped on my paw the next minute. That's balance. My ribs itched. I hadn't eaten in a day, unless you count the half-dried beetle I licked out of a discarded sandal, which, in hindsight, I shouldn't. Beetles are fine until they look back. I wandered past a sleeping guard slumped against a sun-bleached wall. His helmet perched beside him like a loyal but useless friend. He snored in 3 tones, low, lower, and regretful. I stepped around him gently, because I knew how it felt to collapse against stone and wish it were softer. The temple gates were open already. I could smell the incense, sharp and arrogant, and the sour traces of last night's sacrifice. Somewhere deep inside, a priest was chanting the names of gods. But from this distance, it sounded like someone clearing their throat for an eternity. I didn't go in. Not today. Not with the sun watching so closely. Instead, I jumped onto the bakery roof, which was always warm even before morning, and nestled beside a crack where air escaped like whispers. Below, 2 men argued about fish prices while a dog chewed on something that might once have been philosophy. He growled with his whole body. I ignored him. Dogs are too obvious. All bark and tail, like hieroglyphs drawn by someone in a hurry. I prefer things with layers. The baker's wife spilled flour on her sandals and didn't notice. She stepped into the house, leaving ghost footprints behind her like a spirit with poor balance. I followed the smell of chickpeas to the edge of the square, where an old man threw crumbs and insults with equal generosity. He yelled at a group of boys chasing a hoop, calling them sons of dried fish. I didn't understand the insult, but I respected the energy. One of the boys tripped and landed near my paw. He looked at me, eyes wide, as if I had answers. I blinked once, slow and full of mystery. He ran off as if I'd whispered the secrets of the pyramids. I stretched again, just for effect. Cats are performers when we feel like it. I settled into the shadow of a pillar that had once been important, now chipped and forgotten like a half-finished prayer. A fly landed on my nose. I didn't move. Let it explore. Let it think I was a ruin. We all are eventually. Someone began sweeping the alley nearby, raising more dust than they removed. The world smelled like crushed mint, tired bricks, and regret. My stomach reminded me that pride is not edible. I considered chasing the rat that had been mocking me from beneath the market bench for the past 3 days, but decided against it. He had a limp and too many opinions. Besides, I was still tired from sleeping. I scratched behind my ear and stared at nothing, which in Egypt is a full-time job. The heat began its slow rise, creeping over rooftops like gossip. I closed my eyes again, not to sleep, but to avoid participating. My tail twitched once, possibly to swat away a thought. You wouldn't survive this kind of morning, not if you liked schedules or slippers, not if you thought worship came with food. In Egypt, even the sacred wake up hungry. And sometimes, all that keeps you moving is the memory of figs and the stubborn belief that maybe today someone will drop something interesting. Preferably soft, not moving, and only slightly cursed. I hadn't planned to enter the temple that morning, but the scent of roasted barley mixed with hibiscus pulled me toward the gate like a rope tied to my ribs. I slipped in unnoticed, which is both a talent and a curse, depending on where you end up. The inner courtyard shimmered with heat and perfume, and everything smelled vaguely like wealth and a poorly cleaned knife. There were lilies scattered on the stone, some already browning at the edges, curling like tired tongues. A line of robed priests moved in rhythm, chanting the names of gods that no one had fed in centuries. Their voices rose and fell like the tide, though I preferred the ocean's honesty. At the far end of the courtyard, on a raised platform, lounged the temple cats, a purring parade of perfection, drenched in oil and arrogance. One of them, a sleek white tom with a gold earring, flicked his tail with the precision of a hieroglyph. I think his name was something dramatic, like Sutek's Whisper or the Moon's Eye. I called him Crumb, because once, years ago, I saw him choke on one. His fur shone like the belly of a rich man's wife, soft and overconfident. He lay there blinking slowly at nothing, the way cats do when they're sure the world was made for their eyelids. A priest leaned over him with reverence, dabbing his paws with scented water while chanting about purity. I sneezed, loudly. It echoed off the columns like a minor curse. Several heads turned, including Crumb's, who gave me the kind of look usually reserved for Stains. I sat down anyway, because I'm nothing if not impolite. The floor was warm. The incense was stifling. One of the younger priests tried to shoo me with the corner of his scroll, as if I were a smudge in his theology. I bared a tooth, just one, and he hesitated. I remained. A novice brought out a plate of dried fish, arranged in the shape of an eye, with some strange paste in the center that smelled of crushed olives and regret. One of the temple cats sniffed it, looked offended, and walked away. I, on the other hand, considered leaping for it, but remembered my dignity. So, I waited until the priest looked away, then took a step forward. Just one. Enough to see the horror in their faces. The street cat, in the sacred circle. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, thin and dusty and undeniably alive. That was enough. One of the older priests muttered a prayer under his breath. Another crossed himself with water that hadn't been changed in 3 days. The oil lamps flickered like gossip. I walked slowly around the edge of the platform, tail high, pretending I didn't smell like wet bricks and old fig pits. A temple cat hissed under his breath, soft, controlled, diplomatic. I ignored him. He wore eyeliner. I found a small patch of shadow near a pillar and curled up there, just to prove I could. The stone was cool. The silence was golden. Then someone dropped a bronze bowl. It rang like the end of the world. Crumb bolted. A striped priest shrieked something about omens. I didn't move. I'd heard worse. One time, a woman sang for 7 hours straight outside a granary because she believed the grain spirits needed romance. I left her a mouse. She cried. Somewhere behind me, a priest began wiping the oil from a sacred cat's tail with lavender cloth. I watched him, amused. Once, someone tried to bathe me in goat's milk. I bit their sandal and never saw them again. The ritual continued, slightly more tense now. I was a wrinkle in their order, a smear on their papyrus, a reminder that not all cats were sacred, and not all sacred things were clean. I think that's why they hated me, not because I was dirty or loud or poor, but because I didn't want to be anything else. One of the younger temple cats approached me, his steps soft and ceremonial. He sniffed once, recoiled, and whispered something that sounded like feral. I smiled, which is difficult with whiskers. He backed away. I rested my head on my paws and closed one eye. I could still hear the prayers, the shuffling of robes, the slow movement of sun across polished stone. But I was no longer part of it. I never had been. You wouldn't survive as a cat in ancient Egypt if you believed worship was warmth or oil meant kindness. They bathed the sacred cats in perfume, yes, but try sneezing in front of a statue and see how fast they call you an omen. I survived because I expected nothing. Because I knew that oil made you slippery and gold made you visible. And I liked my invisibility. It kept me fed, sometimes. And it kept my soul mine. The sun climbed higher, like it had something to prove, and by midday, the air had thickened into soup. The kind no one ordered, steaming with sweat, crushed herbs, and the soft rot of open baskets left too long in the light. The city moved slower now, dragging its limbs in shade like it owed the day an apology. I padded across the stones, careful not to burn my paws, though I still winced every third step. An involuntary dance that, had it been observed, might have passed for elegance. My fur, already dusted in morning sand, had begun to clump where the heat met memory. A line of donkeys passed carrying amphorae of water, their hooves beating a rhythm older than language. One of them sneezed and nearly fell sideways. I related. On the corner, near the spice merchant's tent, a pile of turmeric had exploded into the breeze, covering a row of cabbages and one confused boy, who now resembled a statue of failed curry. I walked through it, slow as a god, and ended up with yellow on my whiskers and a sneeze that echoed through 3 clay jars. The spice merchant glared. I ignored him. If he didn't want divine intervention, he shouldn't display it so close to the ground. Somewhere nearby, fish was being overcooked to death a second time, and I swore the wind had given up trying to carry pleasant smells. Instead, it delivered heat and vinegar in equal measure. I ducked under a table, where a man with too many rings was selling amulets that looked suspiciously like dried figs with string. A woman bought one, kissed it, and tied it to her elbow. I think it was for fertility. Or digestion, maybe both. I crept on past a crooked sundial that hadn't worked in weeks because a pigeon refused to move from the gnomon. Time, therefore, had stopped at confused and sticky. A scribe sat nearby, fanning himself with a scroll. He wasn't reading it. I suspect he couldn't. But it made a very satisfying noise when flapped. 2 children played a game that involved kicking a ball of woven reeds into a pile of sandals. Every time they missed, they blamed the sun, the gods, or each other's ears. I paused beside them long enough to be called a referee, then left before someone tried to wrap me in linen. Again, I found a sliver of shade beneath the potter's stall, between a cracked water jug and a basket of pottery shards labeled lucky fragments. I curled into myself and watched the world unravel. Flies danced over everything, No one swatted them. It was too hot for anger. A cat nearby, older than me, with one ear and no tail, mumbled something about reincarnation. I nodded. Sometimes, this place did feel like a second chance at something worse. A priest walked past, carrying a jar of honey, and a face like he'd just swallowed a proverb. He dripped a little on the ground. I licked it up. It tasted like a lie, told politely. Farther down the alley, a group of men lifted a body, wrapped in white cloth, onto a wooden cart. One of them tripped, and the cart tilted. The head made a thud. No one spoke. I blinked. The men laughed awkwardly. One muttered, "He would have found that funny." I doubted it. Dead humans rarely had a sense of humor, unless mummification came with punchlines. I moved again, searching for something cooler than stone. My paws itched. My spine ached. A boy tried to offer me a piece of bread dipped in something green. I sniffed it and sneezed. He giggled and dropped the rest on his foot. He limped away, singing a song about cats and curses. I approved. The baker's dog barked at me from behind a stall. I stared at him until he forgot why he was angry. Then he yawned and lay down in defeat. Victory is a matter of patience. I made my way to the edge of the square, where the palm trees cast long, lazy shadows that smelled like wet bark and bird droppings. I collapsed beneath one, melting into the earth like spilled thought. My ears twitched at every whisper of wind, but mostly I just listened to my own breath. Slow, shallow, shaped like questions. You wouldn't survive a day like this. Not with your fur too clean, your stomach too sensitive, your soul too loud. Egypt doesn't care for comfort. It offers you a rock and asks if you can dream on it. If you say yes, it gives you another, warmer, harder, cracked, and if you're lucky, maybe a fig, slightly crushed. Still sweet, night in Egypt is never truly quiet. The walls breathe, the ground hums, and the stars blink like old cats with cataracts. The temple, however, pretends at silence. After sunset, the priests vanish into smaller rooms to mumble private chants and oil their regrets, while the corridors fill with the smell of melting wax, scorched stone, and a hint of boiled date pits. I slipped in through the side gate, past the sleeping guard who always drooled into his palm, and padded softly over the cool mosaic floor, following the memory of roasted goat and the hope that crumbs were sacred too. The offering hall was empty except for a single bowl left near the altar, containing what looked like bread soaked in something red and philosophical. I sniffed it. It smelled like regret and goat. I took a lick. It tasted like someone else's promise. A flicker of movement caught my eye, too slow for a mouse, too heavy for a beetle, and not human. I froze. The shadows in temples are long and layered, like priests' stories. Sometimes they hide nothing. Sometimes they hide exactly what you fear. I crouched low, moving between columns, my body pressed to the stone like a question left unanswered. In the far corner, behind a curtain of faded blue linen, something shifted. It didn't make a sound. That's how I knew it wasn't human. Humans always make sound, even in silence. The twitch of muscle, the scuff of fabric, the sigh they think is private. This thing was still, too still. I circled, slow, careful, like a thought unsure of itself. The smell was wrong. Not decay, not incense, not even fear. It smelled like absence, like something had been scraped out of the air and left hollow. I peeked around the column and saw eyes. Open, unblinking, not glowing. Just there, watching. like someone who remembers you from a life you don't recall. I sat, not out of bravery, but because my legs had opinions. The thing blinked. Once. Slowly. I blinked back. If this was a test, I'd already failed. I'd licked the offering and stepped on a sacred scroll on my way in. Somewhere above us, a ceremonial owl let out a snore. Yes, a snore. They keep her in the rafters to symbolize wisdom. She eats too much and dreams loudly. I once saw her fall off the beam during a thunderstorm and land on a statue of Horus. The priest called it a sign. I called it gravity. The eyes didn't move. I didn't move. We shared a moment, long and flat, like stale bread. Then the curtain shifted again, and a priest entered carrying a tray of what appeared to be feathers and oil. He didn't see me. Or maybe he pretended not to. That's a temple trick. Ignore what you can't explain until it becomes someone else's problem. He placed the tray near the altar, muttered a phrase that sounded like a warning wrapped in velvet, and left. The thing behind the curtain didn't react. It just sat, breathing, if that's what you could call it. I backed away slowly, tail low, heart in my whiskers. As I turned the corner, I stepped on something soft and ancient. A ceremonial feather, bent, damp, and distinctly unsacred. I sneezed. Somewhere in the hall, a statue cracked, possibly unrelated. I retreated into the storage room behind the oil jars, where the walls smelled of mildew, beeswax, and unfulfilled ambition. I curled up between a box of crushed reeds and a sack of lentils and tried not to think. But thinking is what night is for. I thought about the eyes, about the thing that didn't move, didn't speak, didn't smell, but was. You wouldn't survive a night like that. Not if you needed answers, or explanations, or closure. Egypt doesn't offer closure. It offers presence. Weight. The kind you carry in your chest when the room is empty but still feels full. I closed my eyes, ears twitching at every creak, every breath of stone, and I dreamed of the offering bowl. Because for all its mystery and dust, it had still tasted like goat. I woke up wedged between two baskets of dried figs and a cracked jug of vinegar, the kind that smells like old arguments and pickled dreams. The market was already alive, groaning under the weight of voices, footsteps, and sun. Everything shimmered, cloth, copper, skin, as if the morning had decided to melt everything just a little, to test its resilience. I stretched, slow and sore, and shook off a few beetles who'd mistaken my spine for real estate. The ground beneath me was warm, sticky in places, and covered in a thin layer of flour, ash, and something that might once have been melon. I moved through the legs of traders and customers, past dangling onions and bruised dates, toward the butcher's stall, where flies held court like minor deities. The meat hung on strings, like tired moons, swaying with each breath of breeze. It smelled both promising and offensive, the way some truths do. I crouched behind a basket of grain, calculating angles. The man behind the stall was old, blind, and built like a boulder that had opinions. He moved with startling precision, his ears twitching at every sound. They called him Kitty. He called everyone else Noise. I waited. He turned. I pounced, light as breath, toward a strip of salted goat, only to be startled by a loud voice to my left yelling something about 7 dates for a copper or may your sandals rot. I skidded, missed, and tumbled sideways into a sack. It was soft, dry, and immediately invaded every orifice of my face. Cumin. Mountains of it. I sneezed violently. The sack shook. From outside, I heard Katie mutter, "The gods again." I froze. He shuffled closer, poked the sack with a stick, and sighed. "Still testing me," he said, then turned away to scold a boy for breathing too loudly near the lamb. I stayed inside the cumin, buried in a world of dust and spice, my nostrils weeping from the violence of aroma. It was like drowning in someone's overly enthusiastic recipe. Eventually, I crawled out, coughing dignity, and staggered behind a stack of flatbread where a woman argued with herself about the price of garlic. A child spotted me, pointed, and declared I was the sneeze cat from last time. I gave him my best sacred glare. He offered me a chickpea. I accepted. It was cold and philosophical. I crept deeper into the market, through swirls of cinnamon and wet clay, past a man who sold only broken combs and claimed they untangled curses. Two women debated the authenticity of a perfume that smelled like anxiety and lemon. A dog chased a cart full of lettuce and got distracted by his own tail. I passed him again 5 minutes later, still circling, eyes wide with purpose. Freedom is a loop. A spice merchant stood on a crate, waving a feather and yelling about saffron. I leapt onto his table, narrowly avoided a pyramid of star anise, and helped myself to a crumb of something fried and once alive. He threw a sandal at me. It missed and hit a jar of mustard seeds, which erupted in protest. I vanished into a pile of linen, curled under a folded tunic, and listened to the market breathe. There's something honest about chaos. You wouldn't survive here. Not if you needed peace or silence or a straight path. Markets aren't made for order. They're made for motion. For noise and sweat and smells that punch your nose and whisper secrets into your fur. I heard Katie again, somewhere behind me, talking to no one. "It's the gods," he said. "They're watching, always hiding in the cumin." I smiled. You don't have to see the world to know what's in it. Sometimes, you just have to listen. Sometimes, you just have to sneeze. I left the market as the sun began to harden, curling over rooftops like a cat deciding where to nap. My fur smelled of meat, mistakes, and too much spice. I was tired, but I was fed. And free. Mostly. You wouldn't survive a morning like that. Not if you thought freedom came without consequences. Freedom in Egypt comes with cumin. And cumin lingers. I found the entrance by accident. A low stone arch behind the apothecary's wall, hidden beneath trailing vines and the smell of pressed oils. It wasn't locked, of course. Nothing sacred is locked. It simply assumes you won't enter unless invited. I entered. The floor was smooth, too smooth, like it had been scrubbed of memory. No sand, no leaves, not even the hint of a passing lizard. The walls glowed with oil lamps set in delicate alcoves, their flames steady, unwavering, unnaturally disciplined. The air smelled like field flowers and hot linen. Not real flowers, but the scent people think flowers should have. Clean, hollow, slightly suspicious. I moved quietly, my paws barely brushing the polished surface. Every sound I made felt like a sin. Around me, the walls were painted with scenes of cats sitting beside gods, cats carrying scrolls, cats feeding grapes to lounging pharaohs. One fresco showed a cat spooning honey into a king's mouth, while another played a harp. I sat and stared at that one for a long time. It made my whiskers twitch. The corridors opened into a central hall, filled with cushions too symmetrical to trust. A group of cats lounged in a perfect circle around a bowl carved from lapis lazuli. It was empty. Of course it was. Things that perfect are always for looking, never for using. One of the cats turned to glance at me, slow, soft, soundless, then looked away as if I were dust on a ledge. I walked past them. Their fur shimmered in unison, like a cult of moonbeams. No one moved. No one blinked. I think one of them was fake. A statue, maybe. Or a particularly obedient introvert. I climbed onto a platform near the back, where a carpet lay so precisely aligned with the stone pattern beneath that I couldn't stop staring at the edges. They were too straight. Aggressively straight. I scratched at a corner. It didn't move. I sneezed. The sound was muffled instantly by the room. Even echoes knew better here. In the far wall, a small fountain whispered into a silver basin. The water smelled of mint and submission. I sniffed it, lapped once, then frowned. It tasted like rules. A priest entered through a silent door, his feet wrapped in cloth so fine they didn't touch the floor, or at least pretended not to. He lit more lamps, rearranged the already symmetrical cushions, and adjusted a statue's tail by a fraction of a breath. Then he left. No one acknowledged him. Not even the statues. I sat beside the basin and watched the ripples. Nothing happened. For a long time. Too long. Long enough to begin wondering if time was measured here at all, or simply curated. That's the word. The place was curated. Every surface, every breath, every whisker. I missed the cumin. At least cumin was honest. One of the holy cats rose slowly, stretched without effort, and walked toward a raised pillow at the center of the room. It climbed atop it like memory climbing into sleep, curled once, and stared at the wall. I think it was meditating, or perhaps just bored in a dignified manner. I tried to lie down, but the pillow I chose was too soft, unnaturally soft, like bread without crust. My spine disapproved. I shifted. The fabric made no sound. Even discomfort was quiet here. Somewhere above, a bell chimed once, a clear, pure note that hung in the air like judgment. All the cats blinked, in unison. I left. Not in anger, not even in rejection. Just left. Slipped through the arch the way I'd come, back into the chaos of heat and smell and sound. Outside, someone was shouting about chickpeas. A child ran past holding a goose. Someone sneezed loudly and didn't apologize. It felt right. You wouldn't survive in that place. Not if you needed movement, or dust, or air that doesn't smell like obedience. Perfection is a cage with silk bars. And freedom, even when it stinks of fish guts, is always louder than lavender. Evening on the riverfront came with a kind of ache. Not sharp, not loud, just a slow pull behind the ribs, like something remembering how it used to move. The docks creaked with age and ambition. Wet ropes coiled like lazy snakes, and the sky hung low with a soft orange that smelled of fish, fatigue, and distant cities no one could name. I stepped carefully across warped planks, paws landing on warm salt crust and the occasional shrimp husk. The air was thick with old scales, fresh gossip, and the perfume of fishermen who hadn't changed their tunics in 3 dynasties. A man sang something tuneless about a storm and a lost sandal. I liked him. He once gave me the tail end of a smoked eel and told me I had the eyes of someone who'd seen too much. I licked my paw and didn't answer. That seemed to please him. I passed a pile of nets still dripping from the morning haul. A fish flopped once, dramatically, then gave up. Nearby, a cat I didn't recognize was gnawing on something gray and indecisive. He looked at me, shrugged, and said, "It's not good, but it has character." I nodded. Some meals are more about survival than satisfaction. A crew of men unloaded amphorae from a squat boat with a painted ibis on its bow. One of them dropped a jar, and it burst into what smelled like sour figs and fermented regret. Another sailor picked me up, laughed, and said, "Thought you were a sack of dates." I bit his thumb gently. He laughed harder and set me down. Humans love to mistake things. Along the edge of the dock, gulls argued over a torn net. One of them swooped down, grabbed a scroll from a crate marked "Important," and soared into the sky. No one chased her. The map fluttered behind like a flag of stupidity. She flew inland, toward the desert. I wished her luck. Somewhere beneath a tarp, a woman brewed something in a blackened pot and whispered spells to the steam. I sat beside her for a while, comforted by the way she didn't acknowledge me. The pot hissed. She hummed. I dozed. The sky deepened. Stars began to blink through the haze, each one soft as a promise never kept. I wandered to the edge of the pier and stared at the boats. Fat, wooden things with cracked sails and names painted in letters no one remembered how to read. One rocked gently, its ropes singing against the mast like tired lullabies. I imagined climbing aboard, curling into a corner, vanishing into movement and mist. The idea pleased me, for exactly 7 seconds. Then the wind changed, and I smelled the truth. Boats didn't forget. They carried memory in their boards, guilt in their grooves, and no one welcomed a cat without a story. Not one that smelled like old cumin and poor decisions. You can leave a city, but you can't leave yourself. I turned away. A boy threw a stone into the water and shouted something heroic. The splash was unimpressive. Still, his joy echoed like it mattered. A jar of olives rolled off a table and into the mud. I watched as 2 men debated whether to save it or let the gods decide. I cleaned my paw. Some choices aren't worth weighing. Beneath the pier, a rat ran past dragging half a mango and 3 secrets. I let him go. I wasn't hungry enough for lies. A breeze curled around my whiskers, cool and honest, and for a moment I felt nothing but weight, not heavy, just present, like gravity admitting it missed me. I curled beside a broken crate filled with damp rope and empty stories. My eyes half closed. The sea breathed. The stars blinked. You wouldn't survive a night like this? Not if you needed destination, or clarity, or the kind of hope that points in straight lines. Here everything drifts, even dreams, even cats. The door to the offering storeroom was half ajar, held open by a wedge of dried fruit, so unidentifiable it may have belonged to a previous century. I slipped through without effort, the air immediately changing from warm to damp, like breath trapped in a jar. The room smelled of mildew, old incense, and something halfway between rot and reverence. The stone beneath my paws was slick with condensation, dust clinging in slow patches like tired ghosts. Crates lined the walls, marked in faded ochre script. Gifts, blessings, names. Most had not been touched in months. A pile of barley had gone soft, collapsed inward, steaming faintly from the quiet fermentation of neglect. I poked it. It sighed. At the far end of the room, a bundle of linen sat atop a platform, too neatly wrapped to be innocent. I crept closer. Something inside glowed faintly. Not gold, not fire, not reflection. Just a low, steady pulse like a thought that refused to fade. I sniffed. It smelled of copper and dried figs. I didn't touch it. Not because I was afraid, but because it looked like it would remember. To the left, a basket held a collection of carved bones, charms, and one particularly judgmental scarab, wrapped in blue ribbon and twisted into a ball, like someone tried to gift wrap a warning. I sat beside it, unsure whether to be amused or impressed. One of the bones, long, narrow, too clean, leaned out from the pile like it wanted to be noticed. I licked it, not out of hunger, out of boredom. It tasted like someone who died with opinions. Something rustled behind the crates. I paused, watched. Nothing emerged. I crept forward, tail low, nose twitching. A mummified fig rolled into view, stopped, and stared at me with the energy of a fruit that had lived too long. I ignored it. Behind a jar of dried reeds, I found a shallow bowl with traces of something once edible. I sniffed, hesitated, and took a bite. It was ceremonial. The kind of food offered not to be consumed, but to prove generosity. Even the mice had refused it. I chewed slowly, with commitment but no joy. That's survival. In one corner of the room, someone had spilled oil long ago, and now the stone held a permanent stain in the shape of a sleeping bird. I liked it. It didn't move. It didn't judge. It simply was. A heavy silence pressed into the space, not empty, but full of everything that had once mattered. Coins with faces worn smooth, beads from necklaces given in love or obligation, seeds that never touched soil. It felt like a room built for forgetting. I lay down beside a torn sack of lentils, half spilled like a failed metaphor, and stared at the glowing bundle. It pulsed, barely, like it was waiting for someone to remember its name. You wouldn't survive in here, not if you needed sound or story, not if you thought hunger always came from the belly. Some hunger is quieter. It sits in corners. It grows beneath the skin, between thoughts, and smells like places that don't have doors. I closed my eyes. The stone beneath me was cold. The air didn't move. Somewhere in the silence, the scarab ribbon creaked. I purred once. Software, not for comfort, for acknowledgement. I didn't belong here. But for a moment, the room didn't mind. It began like an accident. A soft tapping on clay, too light to be urgent, too hesitant to be trusted. The first drops fell unevenly, like a child testing a drum with one finger. I was stretched across a warm rooftop near the market, belly to stone, ears half asleep, when the smell shifted. Dust, usually still and flat, rose like memory shaken from old cloth. The sky was gray in places where it was usually gold, and the air tasted like someone had stirred the horizon with a wet reed. I lifted my head. Below, the humans were already reacting, lifting baskets, shouting instructions, covering figs with linen, cursing at the clouds as if they were late guests at a dry wedding. Someone screamed something about divine punishment. Another shouted for her mother's knees, which seemed oddly specific. I remained where I was. Cats have a complicated relationship with water. We accept it in bowls, in fish, in legends, but we prefer it polite, not flung from the sky like poorly aimed blame. The stones began to darken, not with weight, but with the memory of what they once held. The city smelled of wet bread, panic, and the sharp honesty of unwashed feet. I moved carefully toward a shaded wall, dodging the first committed streams of water with the grace of someone who's been disappointed by the heavens before. A priest ran past, clutching a scroll above his head. It was clearly not waterproof. His sandals squelched like guilt. Behind him, a temple servant struggled to wedge a small ceremonial umbrella beneath the left foot of a statue of Osiris. The statue did not respond. The umbrella folded inward and dripped in defeat. I leapt from the roof onto a stack of damp palm mats, then onto the awning of a closed grain stall. It sagged under my weight, exhaled, and held, for now. On the street below, a group of children danced in the puddles until an elder clapped sharply and pointed to the sky. They scattered, like laughter chased by expectation. I licked the edge of my paw and wiped at my face. Not because I was wet, but because I didn't want to be. A man fell in the mud and declared the gods were offended by his haircut. His companion laughed until he slipped too. Balance. I padded along the narrow ledge toward a niche where the rain barely reached. From there, the city looked smaller, shinier, newer, as if the water meant something. But I knew better. Drought isn't only in the sky. Sometimes it's in the way a place forgets how to hold change. You can pour all the water you want, but if the clay's already baked through, it just beads and rolls off. Still, the moment had beauty. Not in the droplets, or the wet banners, or the glistening steps, but in the pause. That collective breath when everyone listens, just for a second, to something they didn't expect. A cat darted past me with wild eyes and a tail like a brushstroke. He was soaked, furious, and muttering about betrayal. I didn't ask. I knew that look. I once spent half a day inside a leaking amphora and came out smelling like vinegar and vengeance. The rain thickened. The scent deepened. Everything slowed. Even the flies took shelter. I curled into a tight shape beneath a crumbling cornice and listened to the world drip. You wouldn't survive this, not because of the water, but because of what it brings out. You think rain means renewal, that it washes away. But here, it only wakes the scent of everything that's been rotting quietly. Old fruit, stale sweat, secrets stored in clay pots no one opens. I closed my eyes and breathed it all in. It wasn't pleasant, but it was true. And in Egypt, truth is rarer than rain. The rain had stopped, but the world still dripped. From rooftops, from awnings, from the corners of statues whose mouths always seemed slightly open, like they were about to confess something but changed their minds. The stones beneath my paws were slick, streaked with the wet memory of earlier chaos. Each step left a faint print, not sharp, not bold, just enough to suggest presence. I moved slowly through the narrow alley behind the temple, where shadows leaned longer and the air clung like a robe made of sighs. Somewhere nearby, a jar tipped over with a thud and a splash, followed by a muttered curse and the quiet apology of clay. Then silence again, the kind that listens. I paused near the base of a carved wall, where ivy fought with geometry, and saw her, the temple girl, not a priestess, not a novice, just one of those in-between figures who sweep the holy steps, refill lamps, and know more than they're allowed to say. She carried a shallow bowl, balanced in both hands, and her footsteps made no noise, as if the rain had taught her something. She stopped beneath an overhang, set the bowl down with reverence, and pressed her palm lightly to the wall. Not a prayer, just contact. Then she turned and left without looking back. I waited. Always wait. That's the first rule of surviving kindness. Let it settle. Let it show its teeth if it has any. The bowl remained still. I approached slowly, tail low, ears high, senses tuned to the possibility of traps disguised as charity. It had happened before. Once, a woman offered milk laced with something floral and smug. I drank it, then spent 4 hours watching my own tail explain ethics to a pile of bricks. Never again. I sniffed the edge of the bowl. Lentils, a scrap of goat, and a triangle of bread so stale it could be used as a warning sign. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't just food. Nothing left in the open ever is. A fly landed on the rim and washed its face with unsettling enthusiasm. I flicked it off. A trail of paw prints led toward the bowl from the other direction. smaller than mine, more delicate, as if a kitten had arrived earlier and been chased off by decision. The last print had been circled with a thin red ribbon, tied in a loop, like someone wanted to commemorate hesitation. I stared at it for a long moment, then ate the lentils, slowly, chewing each one as if it had an opinion. The goat was tough, but sincere. The bread tried its best. Somewhere above me, a torch flickered in protest against the damp. I heard the rustle of fabric behind a shutter. A man sneezed into the silence and whispered an apology to the gods. I licked the bowl clean, not from hunger, but from principle. Waste attracts stories. Better they be mine. I curled beside the empty dish, my body warm against the cold wall, and stared into the nothing that hummed quietly around the edges of the temple. You wouldn't survive a gift like this. Not if you needed meaning to be obvious. Not if you thought kindness arrived with banners and explanations. Here, offerings are left without names. Food appears for mouths that might not say thank you. And every gesture is a risk, folded neatly into ritual. I dozed, not deeply, just enough to let the bowl cool beside me. Enough to remind the night that I was still here, still watching, still unsure whether this was mercy or bait wrapped in mercy's skin. By midday, the air had forgotten how to move. It hung heavy over rooftops, pressed against walls, and slid down necks like a tired apology. Nothing made noise unless it had to. The market was asleep. With eyes open, baskets slumped like they too needed shade. I found a spot beneath a broken awning near a crate of chipped amphorae, cool only by comparison, and curled into the smallest version of myself. A child sat nearby, looping a length of string between his fingers, trying to tie a knot that kept untying itself. He hummed, off-key and unbothered, and once in a while scolded the string for disobedience. Across from him, perched on an overturned storage box, was an old man with sandals older than truth and a beard that hadn't chosen a direction in years. He spoke slowly, not to the child, not to the crowd, just into the heat. I kept one eye half open. Cats are good at pretending not to listen. There was a time, he said, when the sun went missing. He paused, licked his lips like they were a scroll, and continued. People wailed, threw lentils at statues, blamed fish. I twitched. Turned out a cat had eaten it. Swallowed it whole, just to see what light tasted like. The child giggled. The string fell. The old man didn't smile. Took 3 gods, a goat, and a jar of vinegar to get it back. The cat apologized but never stopped glowing in the dark. He squinted toward the horizon where heat blurred the edge of buildings into mirage. That's why some nights feel warm, even with no fire. That's sun residue, cat breath. I sneezed. He looked at me, briefly, as if I confirmed his theory. He scratched his knee. Not all stories are meant to be believed, he said. Some are just for remembering things you never lived. The child made the string into a circle, nodded solemnly, and declared it a crown. The man nodded back, as if that settled everything. A fly buzzed past, too slow to escape its own wings. I shifted slightly, enough to feel the stone beneath me. Dry, cracked, textured like memory. The man reached into a satchel and pulled out a flat piece of wood, smooth from age, and placed it on his knee. Upon it sat a small turtle, motionless except for the blink. This one's got a map on her back, he said, drawn by a priest who never left his room. He tapped her shell gently. Leads to nowhere, but the route is honest. I blinked. The child leaned closer, whispered something to the turtle, then kissed her head. She didn't move. Some myths need silence to survive. The man continued. There's a tomb outside the city, he said. No door, no name. Inside, just a bowl and a brush. Legend says it's where forgotten dreams go to be repainted. He looked at the sky again. Or maybe it's just a storage closet. The child pointed to a cloud that wasn't there. The old man squinted. Yes, he said. That's the one? I yawned, slow and deliberate, but didn't leave. His voice had the rhythm of something older than truth, softer than certainty. He spoke like the stones, cracked, warm, still holding heat from a sun long gone. You wouldn't survive a moment like this. Not if you needed structure. Not if you wanted your stories to mean something clear. Here they drift. They loop. They smell like fish and dust and carry more feeling than fact. And sometimes, in the right kind of stillness, they're the only thing that moves. The child fell asleep, with the string still wrapped around his fingers. The turtle blinked once more. The old man kept talking, not to be heard, but because the air needed weight. I stayed. Because sometimes, the stories you don't believe are the ones that follow you the longest. Night along the docks was different than inland, quieter, but not because nothing moved, because everything moved in whispers. The boats creaked in their sleep, ropes shifted like sighs, and water slapped against stone with the softness of someone knocking on a closed door, unsure if they want it opened. I padded across the narrow ledge behind the salt warehouse, where the alley narrowed into a crack between buildings barely wide enough for a thought to pass through. The air there was cool, wet, thick with fish bones and old secrets. A single lantern flickered nearby, then went out. Not violently, just gave up. Somewhere far behind me, someone sang a slow tune in a language that no longer matched its mouth. A song for the dead, or the nearly. I paused at the edge of the gap between walls, drawn not by sound or smell, but something else. A pull, not strong, just enough to make my paw hesitate before stepping past it. I turned, looked, and saw myself. Not in a mirror, not reflected in glass or water, but in darkness. A perfect outline. Same ears, same shoulders, same tail. Still. Too still. I stared. It stared back. We blinked. Not together. I moved slightly. It didn't. A draft touched my spine. The alley behind was empty. I lifted a paw. So did nothing. I twitched my ear. It remained calm. I looked deeper, squinting into the split between stones, and noticed no whiskers. My reflection had no whiskers. My fur was there, the posture, the silence, but no whiskers. Just smooth space where feeling should have lived. I backed away, slowly, carefully. Some things deserve distance. I turned, not hurriedly, that would be admission, and found a dry patch beneath an overturned crate. Saturday. Thought. Blinked 3 times to prove I still could. Nearby, a man rubbed oil into a wooden carving of himself. He did it every week. Said it kept his spirit anchored. Once, I saw him oil his own shadow. He claimed it had started cracking. I didn't argue. The song for the dead continued, fading upward like mist, losing faith in gravity. I licked my paw and wiped my face, focusing on the places I knew were mine. My ears, my nose, my tiredness. I didn't look back at the crack. Not then. Not after. You wouldn't survive a sight like that. Not if you needed yourself to stay stable, to stay yours. Egypt doesn't give you mirrors. It gives you echoes, silhouettes, hints. And sometimes what stares back isn't you, but what remains after you leave. I curled tighter, tail over eyes, and let the night forget me for a while. If I had no whiskers, I didn't want to know. Morning on the outskirts always smelled worse than night in the city center. Not because there was more rot, but because dawn had a way of revealing what the dark let rest. While the temples unfurled their flags and the priests lifted their hands to coax the sky open, I moved alone behind the walls of a crumbled grain store, past rusted pots and things that used to be useful. A pot with no bottom, a sandal gnawed into the shape of a beetle, a rope tied into a knot that no one alive could remember how to undo. All of it hummed with the strange silence that only trash can carry, as if each object was ashamed of still being here, as if it wanted to apologize for not having disappeared. I was hungry, not starving, not desperate, but that dull morning hunger that makes you patient and slow and calculating, like a shadow pretending to be a shadow. I found what might once have been a basket, but was now more whole than weave, and nestled deep inside, under dried fish skin, and what I believe was half a mouse, half a fig. Don't ask me how that happened. Was a broken piece of faience tile, smooth and cool and pale blue. On it, impossibly intact, the face of a goddess stared up at me. Not the whole face, just the eyes, the bridge of the nose, and a mouth so perfectly carved that I flinched, because it was smiling, and not kindly, not like those statues the priests parade with fanfare and perfume, but like it knew something it shouldn't, like it had been waiting, not to be found, but to find me. I sat, forgotten hunger curling back inside me like a tail around my feet, and stared, as cats do, not to admire, but to understand. The more I looked, the less sure I was that the tile had ever belonged to a wall, or a fountain, or anything made for beauty. It felt like it had been made to be lost, like it had waited centuries just to be buried under half-fruit, half-rodent offerings in a corner no one cleaned, like it had arranged itself there knowing I would come sniffing for leftovers and find instead a question I wasn't meant to answer. I tapped it with my paw, lightly, and the tile shifted, revealing what I thought was a rock but turned out to be a dead fly, perfectly preserved, and someone, for reasons I will never understand, had placed a tiny gold plate over its back. Like armor or a crown, like even decay, had earned its ceremonial honors. For a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because I suddenly realized how many things in this place had nothing to do with sense and everything to do with memory. I lay down beside the broken basket and watched as a cloud passed overhead and made everything duller, safer. I thought about how many times I had been mistaken for a sacred cat, how many hands had reached to pet me not for who I was, but for what I symbolized, and how none of them had ever asked me if I believed in gods, or tile fragments, or golden bugs. They just assumed that because I was quiet and clean and shaped like a statue, I must belong to something divine, as if stillness was proof of purpose, as if watching made me wise. I wished, for just a moment, that I could be worshipped without being assigned, admired without being believed in. The breeze shifted, and I caught a scent I didn't recognize. Not food, not ash, something floral and burning, like petals inside smoke. And I knew someone had passed nearby. Not a person, exactly. More like the idea of one. And that idea was looking for something. Not urgently, not frantically, just the way ancient things search. By presence, not motion. I left the tile where it was, not because I respected it, but because I didn't want to know what would happen if I carried it with me. Some signs are invitations, but others are fingerprints left on a door you're not supposed to open. As I walked away, my tail low, I looked once more at the fig mouse, now collapsed into its own contradiction, and thought, maybe this is all any of us are. Halves of something no one ever meant to put together, leftovers of stories that were never finished, searching not for home, but for someone who might look at us and not flinch. I passed the trash heap, the cracked jars, the line of ants carrying things far heavier than their questions, and behind me, I imagined the goddess smiling still, her mouth holding a secret shaped exactly like my name. The temple wasn't far, but distance and heat stretches like old linen. It wrinkles, curls, and clings to your paws as if the road itself doesn't want you there. By the time I reached the cracked stone steps, I wasn't sure if I had walked for minutes or lifetimes, only that the air smelled familiar in a way that made my spine curl, like walking into a room you left as a kitten and finding your scent still clinging to the walls. The priest at the entrance didn't look at me, but he mumbled something that sounded a lot like a greeting and a little like snoring. When I got closer, I saw his eyes were closed, lips moving in half prayers, as if he were trying to remember a script from a dream he hadn't finished. I passed him with no resistance, no acknowledgement, just the soft echo of his breath and the unmistakable whiff of fennel stuck in his beard. The temple hall was dim and sweet, dust holding its breath in the slanted light, and for a moment I thought the room was empty, until I noticed the statue. It wasn't large or grand, or even well carved, just a limestone cat with one ear chipped, one eye uneven, and a thin string tied around its tail holding a tiny bronze bell that swung too slowly as if underwater. The absurdity of it made me blink, because it looked like someone had tried to give the statue a warning system, as if sacred cats needed alarms. Or maybe it was a joke, a forgotten ritual, or a very devout child with too much twine and not enough supervision. I walked past the statue and felt the strange pressure of being watched not by people, but by memory. Not mine, but something older. Something that remembered how I used to look when I was clean and quiet and curled like a question mark under the feet of gods. A temple mouse darted out from behind a pedestal, paused, and stared at me with the authority of a guard dog. Chest puffed, eyes narrowed, tail twitching like a metronome stuck on suspicion. And I nearly laughed aloud, except the silence here was thick, not heavy, just deliberate, like it chose what sounds to keep. I moved slowly, not out of reverence, but caution, because everything felt staged, like a play being rehearsed without actors, just props, and me, the only living thing that didn't know its lines. I jumped onto a ledge near the altar and sat, tail wrapped neatly, posture impeccable, not out of pride but habit, and the moment I settled, I noticed the smell. Not the usual incense or oil or dried myrrh, but something subtler, something intimate. The scent of wet cloth left too long in the sun. The faded trace of a human hand that once held me too tightly. The bitter perfume of overripe dates. It hit me like a memory I never had, like something from another cat's life that I had inherited by mistake. And I wanted to leave, not flee, not run, just exit quietly, as if I had stepped into a thought I wasn't meant to hear. From deeper inside, footsteps echoed, not many, not fast, just two pairs, measured and light. And I knew they weren't coming for me, but I also knew they would stop when they saw me, because that's what people do with cats in temples. They stop, they stare, they whisper old words like spells, and pretend they know your name. I stayed still, as I always do, and waited, not out of obedience, but to see which version of me they would see. the divine messenger, the lazy omen, the silent guardian of something they can't explain but still fear. When the two entered, one young and wide-eyed, the other aged and humming, they both halted mid-step as if choreographed, and the elder tilted her head and said, "He's returned." Not to me, but to the space around me, as if I were just filling a position, a replacement for a symbol they'd lost and had been waiting to respawn. I wanted to meow, just to break the illusion, to remind them I wasn't theirs, wasn't his, wasn't holy, just hungry, tired, and curious. But instead, I blinked slowly, the way we do when we want to be misread. And the young one gasped like she had seen a miracle. And I thought, what a curse, to be loved for what you're not. The elder approached and laid a bowl near the base of the altar. Water, fresh and clean. A single olive floating in it for reasons I will never understand. And I will not lie. I drank, not out of trust, but because thirst doesn't care who offers relief. The bell on the statue behind me rang once. Not loud, not clear, just enough to make the young one jump, and the elder smile. And I realized the absurdity of it all. A chipped effigy with a child's bell, commanding reverence, a priest who sleeps through devotion, a mouse who thinks he's in charge, and me, a cat who only came for shade and left with a prophecy painted on his back. And yet, as I turned to go, something held me in place. Not a leash, not fear, but recognition. That awful, soft pull of things that almost feel like home. Like corners where you once hid. Like words you don't remember learning, but still know how to answer. I stepped backward, not forward, and left the way I came, with the kind of stillness that makes people believe you've accepted something, even when all you've done is survive it. By the time I left the temple, the sun had softened into something less aggressive, like a drunk who'd finally found a chair, and the city had gone quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from absence, but the kind that settles like dust, thick and invisible, hugging every surface with memory. I walked slowly, not out of fatigue, but necessity, because once the world has stared at you like you're sacred, it takes effort to return to being just another shadow under a clay wall. The streets had rearranged themselves, or maybe I had. Doors I didn't recognize were now familiar. Familiar corners now wore strange graffiti. A loop of red paint shaped like a fish with teeth. A dog barked in the distance, then coughed, then stopped, as if even his own voice embarrassed him. And I passed a window where a man slept with a loaf of bread under his head. No blanket. Just the crust pressed against his temple like a lover's palm. And I wondered if that bread had been meant for supper or dreams. I passed another cat, wide-eyed and slinking sideways as if she'd just seen a witch in her soup. And I didn't greet her, not out of arrogance, but because tonight I didn't have the energy to explain where I'd been or who I'd become. My pause led me to the square where once pigeons had conducted ceremonies and children had screamed without consequence. But now it was empty, save for a single lantern hung from a rope, swaying like a decision that hadn't been made yet. I sat near it, the warmth reaching me in pulses, and stared at nothing, which is to say, I stared at everything I wasn't brave enough to name. From an alley came the scent of fish bones, not fresh, but smoked and split. And then, absurdly, the smell of something warm. A griddle heating nothing, just the air, as if someone had prepared to cook a meal and forgotten what it was. I walked toward it, drawn not by hunger, but by habit, and found the source. A small brazier, left alone, with a handful of chicken bones tied into a spiral, sizzling softly in their own confusion. I sat beside it, because cats are drawn to warmth, even if it comes from madness. And I closed my eyes, listening, not for voices, but for confirmation that silence still held space for me. A beetle crawled over my tail and didn't die, which felt like progress. In the distance, someone sneezed with enough drama to make the stars blink, and I felt my ears twitch. Not in annoyance, but in gratitude. Proof that the world was still ridiculous. I thought about the statue in the temple and its silly little bell, about the priest who dreamed his way through duty, about the girl who thought I was a miracle, and the old woman who spoke like time had told her a secret, and I felt something curl inside me. Not pain, not pride, but a quiet recognition that being seen, even wrongly, still means you exist. I lay down with my front paws crossed, not out of formality but comfort, and looked up at the night, which was doing its best not to overwhelm anyone. No moon, just a few stars blinking politely, like distant relatives at a funeral they didn't want to attend. And for the first time that day, I allowed myself to be still without watching, to breathe without checking the wind for danger, to sleep not like a guard, but like someone who knew no one would come. The last thing I saw was a moth trying to land on a rope, missing, circling, and missing again. And I thought, perhaps that's all there is. Circling the thing you think will hold you, missing it repeatedly, and calling it faith. The city didn't care that I had survived, but it made space for me anyway, and that, perhaps, is the gentlest kind of love.